Welcome to 52 Miniatures. My name is Alex and this video is sponsored by Frozen. I'm going to make a little diorama featuring a German Second World War tank, a cobbled street and a rowdy gang of goblins. I walked into a scale model and railway store recently, an awesome place called MJ Hobby, economically uncomfortably close to where I live. Scale modelling as in miniature models, oftentimes in plastic, military vehicles, tanks, planes and ships in various sizes. I picked out a Second World War German Nashorn tank made by Tamiya, an anti-tank gun in a tank. My first scale model purchase since I was a kid. Even then I don't think I ever fully assembled one. The kit is made up of several sprues with lots of bits on each sprue. Lots of bits. That when assembled correctly eventually makes a little plastic replica of a very large tank. My miniature tank venture here is based on childhood nostalgia, a profound feeling that tanks are cool and that I'm excited and curious about human behavior in regard to little miniatures. Explain that last bit? Sure. I love building, painting and playing with miniatures, but I'm into the fantasy and science fiction side of the hobby. You know, elves and dragons and aliens and that. And even if my fantasy miniatures are essentially exactly the same thing, plastic miniature bits that also come on sprues that also reside in boxes lining the walls of a specialized store, equally as economically uncomfortably close, the reality is that the two sides of the same hobby appear far apart. And so today's build is exploring the two sides of this same coin. Scale modelling versus goblins. But let's start by paying attention to the sponsor of this video, Frozen, makers of 3D printers. I was set on a lovely tank and my goblin tank crew. I also wanted a nice diorama, a to my eye typical scale model diorama base. If you ever go into a scale model store that displays miniatures and dioramas, you'll know what I'm talking about. Often simple settings that add to the story of the model, but nothing excessive that competes too much visually with the main attraction. Admittedly, I have checked out quite a few of these simple, quote-unquote, dioramas, most of them scratch-built with enormous attention to detail. Nothing I was going to do this time. Today, I want to paint a tank. Not place individual cobbles on a miniature street, still at it 3 months later, the YouTube channel slowly withering away, a forgotten empty husk occasionally disturbed by hazy yet joyous memories from a golden age of yellow space marines. 3D printing the diorama was so good. I found files by Sawman0, free to download on Thingiverse. Thanks for that, Mr. Sawman0. Files I simply could alter to suit my needs, scale them to a size that would fit the tank, extending a cobbled street with a duplicate of itself. My first print was an experiment to print directly on the plate, but it wasn't my best idea. Although salvageable, I in the end decided to reprint with supports. For those of you without any knowledge about 3D printing, the last couple of sentences would be apparent gibberish. Don't worry, I'm not going to try and explain it. But I want to say this. This Sonic Mini 8K resin printer from Frozen is my first 3D printer. I've now had it for about a year and it has yet to fail me. I fail sometimes, the printer has not. And I've printed a lot. What comes out of the printer is exceptional with ridiculous detail, as you can see in many of my past videos. Apparently the highest resolution consumer resin 3D printer in the world. But honestly, I wouldn't have cared about the quality if the printer was a hassle to work with. My major initial worry, but there was no need to worry. After unboxing, I spent a few days fine-tuning the preset settings, and since I've not changed a thing and I've never had a failure. And the prints are exceptional. This combination makes me happy. 3D printing is now a major asset for me. I don't print many miniatures, but I print bits for miniatures and bits for terrain. Like in this video. Such a simple move that, as you'll see, makes a lovely scene. Sometimes I do wish for a larger printer to make larger dioramas, but that's it. Having the wash and cure from the same company works out great, as well as the plate from the printer fits in the wash station. Minimum risk for a sloppy mess. This video is sponsored by Frozen, something I'm grateful for because they really wouldn't have had to do it. I've so far been pushing this printer regardless. If you are new to 3D printing, but the prospect of technicalities all daunts you, well, I was like that, but I'm happy with this machine. If you're into 3D printing yet looking for a detailed upgrade, what comes out of this printer using Frozen's 8K resin is fab. Thanks, Frozen. Now, I had discussions with people involved in scale modeling about what scale to work with for this project, something that would fit my goblins. So, one of the most common scales for tanks is 1/35th scale. A tank that is 35 times smaller than the original. A scale that was stumbled upon by Tamiya in the 1960s when they designed their first plastic tank scale model. Because the model was motorized and needed to fit batteries and motors, 1/35th is where they ended up, creating a de facto standard. Unfortunately, it's too large a scale to fit with my goblins. Tabletop wargames mainly use what is called 28mm scale. That means that a regular medium-length human miniature would be about 28mm tall, making it about 1/56th scale. I mean, yeah, why use the same scale system when we can confuse everyone by not doing so? So I went for a 1/48th scale tank, closer to the world of 28mm tabletop miniatures. Except this is not really a sensible equation. Scale models pride themselves with being small, yet exact copies of a real-world object. Fantasy and sci-fi tabletop gaming models pride themselves with being small, inexact copies of made-up fantasies. Most proportions are out of the window, and there's no real wish to have a regular medium-length human. There's no wish for a real-world concepts, and so scale becomes quite irrelevant. I compared the tracks from a Warhammer tank to my Nashorn. In scale theory realm, my tank should be slightly larger than the Warhammer tank. In fantasy reality, the Warhammer tank transports mutant superhuman space soldiers across alien planets. Should also be slightly easier to assemble to lure in the kids, and should look, rad. Also to the kids. I guess bigger is better. Another noticeable difference is in the small detailed pieces, not only the multitude of them. A Warhammer gun would not require as many pieces as a scale model gun. Admittedly, the scale model gun did not require much cleanup of mold lines. Anyway, the point is that the delicacy of the scale model detailed bits is not something that would withstand repeated tabletop gameplay. Because this is something we do with our miniatures, play games, like chess pieces, only with more skulls, horns and capes. Scale modelers mainly just look at their models with a feeling of oneness, of zen, meditation through plastic. Whereas the very chunky Warhammer tank can probably be chucked on a concrete floor in a red-eyed rage of dice rolls gone wrong, only to bounce back up again. So the style difference is not just aesthetics, there is practicality involved. The miniature tank was now assembled and it was time to paint. Lucky me, I got a stop-motion self-assembly version, otherwise I would have gone a little bit mad with all the bits. I can say though, past the veil of madness, that Tamiya has figured out something that Games Workshop has not. How to number the bits on the sprue so that one can find them. This whole painting experience was something I was very excited about. For me, there is a freedom of not having expectations, but also of not knowing much about what I'm about to do. Because I like fantasy and sci-fi miniatures, I digest a lot of images and other visual content on that specific subject. Daily images and videos of elves and orcs and space soldiers, alien races and spaceships. Of scale modeling paint jobs, I know nothing, apart from a conceived idea of what I think it should be. Partly what I think it should be is realism. Realism taking into account some exaggeration because of scale. See, when shrinking down a tank, or any miniature for that matter, 48 times its original size, you lose what natural lighting, environment and textures does to the subject at its natural size. Contrast and sense of light kind of needs to be exaggerated for the little miniature to look exciting. Just think of how cool a cliff looks. A big jagged rock, all the angles, all the shadows and light, all the moss, the streaks of different colors of mineral composites. And then compare that to a fist-sized rock. And so, we miniature enthusiasts exaggerate. This is a common nominator between scale modeling and tabletop miniature painting. There is a need to exaggerate, and we use the same kind of paints. Kind of funny that I mentioned the two different stores at an expensive distance. Well, they both stock the same paints, in the same type of racks. But from there on, the divide grows again, regardless of cliffs. I'm going for something that I would call box art likeness, trying to paint the miniature like the image on the box. In this case, a sort of wintry camouflage. The great thing about Tamiya is that the art on the box is actual art and not an expertly painted version of the plastic miniature model. The Tamiya box art leaves a lot for me to interpret, instead of creating potential feelings of inadequate skill. The realism I mentioned earlier makes me grab the airbrush as the default brush, a tool probably more common among scale modelers than among tabletop gaming enthusiasts. But I just can't imagine my tank featuring brush strokes, a thought that would never have struck me with fantasy-style miniatures. Using my prior knowledge of paint, and I guess where to start, what order to best apply paint, technical things that seem universal for all miniature painting, and things start to look good, fast. I've never painted a scale model tank before, but I think that whatever knowledge picked up from fantasy and sci-fi models are easily applied and converted into a scale modeling realm. Something that really affects the way I paint this tank is the flat texture-free surfaces of the scale model. Fantasy and sci-fi models are quite often very embellished with emblems, adornments, textures, all these different parts that need to be considered and painted separately. The tank, on the other hand, pretty much just has three different parts: interior, exterior, and undercarriage track bit. All of them kind of flat with simple geometry. This gives me a chance to paint on more depth and effect. It makes me concentrate on the whole thing as one piece rather than the sum of a lot of little details. Once the airbrush phase was done, by the way, I did work on this entire project in tandem, building the diorama while waiting for the tank paint to dry, painting goblins while the diorama was drying, and so on. But for video purposes, I'm now recreating the story with focus on one thing at a time. Anyway, it was now time to stain the tank. Weathering is a big thing in scale modeling. Going back to the realism. Trying to paint something that looks like it's been used, like it's been out in the weather. I'm going to use oil paint and white spirit for this. Another divider. Scale modelers are keen users of solvent-based products, enamels and oil paints. Tabletop gamers, not so much anymore. It's sort of been partly phased out for some reason. I'm attempting something called dot filtering. It's my first attempt, and I can already see things I might do differently next time. Smaller dots, larger brush, less white spirit. Regardless, I love the effect. Here's the theory. My theory. Oil paint does not excessively stick to an acrylic surface, so one can add paint and then sort of erase it with the help of a brush moist with white spirit. Because a naturally stained surface is often stained by many different things, staining using many colors gives a realistic result. Covering a surface with tiny dots of different colors of oil paints, streak them out in a vertical manner, then wiping off more and more with the brush eraser. Not only does this tint the entire surface like a filter, all the colors slightly mix randomly and naturally. The technique can also create these great differently colored streaks. I used colors that corresponded with my scheme: white, black, green, yellow, dark blue, brown. On the inside I avoided the green but kept the white, adding a dusty kind of vibe. What colors to use for this technique can definitely be experimented with, and one does not have to be afraid of strong colors, as they thin down immensely but also become more drab when streaked together. A wonderful weathering technique that works wonders on larger flat surfaces. As mentioned before, not many of that type of flat surfaces around on sci-fi or fantasy gaming models, unfortunately. In preparation for this dot filtering, I did two important things. One was to varnish the tank with a satin varnish to make sure my airbrushed layers of paint would not be stained too much. The other was to make those initial layers of airbrushed acrylic paint brighter than what I want in the end, as the weathering would darken down the surface. After the dot filtering had settled, I made a wash out of oil paint and white spirit to add some shading to the recesses. White spirit does not have much surface tension, so making a thin paint out of it to then apply to the small recesses in the armoured panels is utterly satisfying. It flows out like nothing in the acrylic world of washes. As a bonus, once the wash is settled and dried to the touch, I can gently erase any excess or mistakes with a cotton bud moistened in white spirit. I use black and grey oil paint mixed with odorless white spirit to make this wash about 1 part paint to 10 parts white spirit. The grey paint was rather unnecessary and I might as well have just used black oil paint. As you've seen, I'm mainly using artist-grade oil paint. Especially when making washes, I find these oil paints superior as they don't break up like hobby brand oil paints tend to do when diluted with a lot of white spirit. As a last step, I use 2 pre-mixed oil washes, just because I like the colours of these two and, well, frankly, there's so much paint lying around I just try and use as much as I can in fear of forgetting why they were there in the first place. These I used for a more deliberate staining. Dark mud on the tracks and undercarriage, as well as streaks and staining on the lower parts of the armoured panels, rust randomly distributed on the undercarriage. Left overnight to dry like the tears of a holy patron saint of miniature modelers, Saint Bit. I don't know, do we have a patron saint? And in that case, do we have 2? 1 for each side of the coin. I then lightly dry brushed the tank with a thin white paint. I don't know if Scalemodelers dry brush. A large brush with very little paint in, lightly brushed over the raised areas to brighten them. A great way to bring out all the bolts and tiny details. The thought struck me, apart from as an oil paint tool, this is the first time I used a brush on this tank. Normally I'd be a little wary of using so much airbrush and oil paint tricks. I do try in my videos to be a little accessible at times. The airbrush is not super common among tabletop painters, and the same audience also has a habit of running for their lives when oil paint and solvents are mentioned. Instant death by cadmium yellow. Whereas my idea of scale modelling mentality is the opposite. If it's possible to add another layer of some weird substance to faithfully recreate mud splatter, then it doesn't matter if it's a very specialized process with a specialized product, as long as the mud looks good. And this is probably one of the bigger differences between scale modelling and tabletop miniature painting. Tabletop miniatures are for a very large part made and bought to be played with as game pieces, on a table. This affects all the decisions of both manufacturers and hobbyists. Durability, ease of assembly, ease to paint, ease to distinguish. Tabletop hobbyists search for techniques that will speed up the painting of 100 little army men, rather than discuss the favoured shine of varnish to best use prior to oil paint staining. I hope we can have a little bit of both. Now, the tank got heavily weathered. I did some chipping, using a sponge and diluted brown paint, a lovely technique. Chipping that I then enhanced with some black and rust-coloured paint for depth and character. I painted on scratches with the same brown paint as well as a brighter paint for not quite white scratches. Enhancing the weathering with some oil paints to make rust streaks and dirt streaks. Making streaks with oil paints is great, again because of the possibility to erase and diffuse with white spirit. Finally, I dusted on pigment powder on the undercarriage and tracks, part lazy, part looks. I painted the entire undercarriage as one piece with the same colours, covering up that time saved on detailed painting with dust and rust. And the tank was done. As you can begin to fathom from the timestamp right now, this video is on the longer side. I had considered dividing it into 2 parts, but decided against it. Why not challenge the norm? Why not give you a TV series episode instead of a 10-minute YouTube blitz? We're about to paint goblins, but I recommend you to go get another cup of tea or maybe stretch your legs. If you haven't liked this video by now, this is the time. These goblins and orc commander are resin miniatures from a company called Cromlech. The fact that they are goblins is not the only thing that makes them different. The sculpts themselves, rough hand sculpts, are very different to the exact precision of a scale model miniature. I've got to say, despite the fact that I enjoy the style of these sculpts, I was disappointed I think the type of molds used when making resin miniatures like this wear out with time. Mold lines get worse and worse, residue resin all over the place. The amount of cleanup needed on some of the goblins was real bad. Also, one of the miniatures was missing an arm. It just was not there on the little sprue. So I had to find a suitable bit in my own miniature stash. Overall, a bit of a disappointing experience that surprised me. Now that 3D printers are a thing, I would have thought that companies making old-school resin bits really would step up their game to stay relevant. After a wash in warm water and a bit of washing up liquid to remove any release agent from the molds, I assembled and zenithal primed the green skins. Using a white paint sprayed over the black primed miniature's head, creating a light map of sorts with shadows and highlights in all the right places. This is very useful when wet blending, which is the technique I'm going to use to paint these miniatures. As you can tell, I want to go for aesthetics completely opposite of the tank. Very visually hand-sculpted miniatures with a style that is quite exaggerated. I mean, the head on some of these goblins are larger than their torsos. Hands are massive compared to what would have been normal. They are perfect examples of the qualities that many fantasy and sci-fi hobbyists enjoy. A world where even regular human-type miniatures have proportions that share little relation to real-life proportions. And there's a lot of character to be found this way, in a sense enlarging what is important for the story. Massive heads or guns or muscles. I mean, the head of a 1/48th scale tank driver from Tamiya is about the size of the nose of one of these goblins. But I mean, they've got some very good looking noses. Makes them look very goblinesque. Orcs apparently don't have noses. Or at least not this one. I've yet to figure out that particular backstory. Wet blending also felt to me like a very non-scale modeling technique, at least the way I do it. Rather rough textures and visible brush strokes. I add several paints to my wet palette. By the way, do scale modelers use wet palettes? Maybe I'm going too far with my questions. I'm just a little astounded at the wall we've built between us. I know your store has modelled trains and mine has board games, but can we not hang out anyway? Also, yes, your store looks like a grown-up person's store with grey-haired people in it. And mine looks like a kid's store, and I'm the only one with grey hair in it. But I'm sure we can fix that. Okay, moving on. Paints in the wet palette. Usually 3 of them, going from a little darker to slightly brighter. Also different colours. Like on the German-ish World War Goblins coats, a brown for the shadows, a muted military green for the midtones, and then a pale warm grey for the highlights. I tried to swap out the grayscale of the zenithal prime for these paints, working fast so that I can blend them together on the miniature. After the first layer is done, I add a little more paint where I've missed a few spots and then go in and highlight the most raised bits using the brightest paint. I've used this same technique throughout all the bits of this spectacular crew. For the skin tones, I was after a very comic book style green, like the Green Goblin or something. I wanted them to look like a fairy tale from the time, as if one of the crew had a dream one night of goblins manning his tank. How would someone in the 1940s imagine a goblin? I don't know. But if it was me, I'd dream what I painted. I spent extra care on the skin, layering on more vibrant green, but also pale skin tone type colours. It was fun to paint without regard for realism. A two-edged sword, really. Painting the tank was liberating because I had limitations, but no knowledge. There was an established style that can be seen in real life, looking at photos of real tanks online or whatever. Yet painting something made up, a fantasy creature, there's a liberation in painting whatever I want, with disregard for convention and reality. This is a big subject I haven't touched. Scale modeling's search for realism can go pretty far. What exact date is that tank supposed to be from? On what front? No, that green was not used until later stages in said war. The mud should have been blue because at that specific side of the mountain during that specific battle there was a landslide that went through a paint factory with a lot of blue pigment inside and But this is a historical fascination, I think, a branch of another tree. And to be honest, we fantasy tabletop gamers can get the same thing if the story is strong enough. Excuse me, but what part of the war is your Gandalf from? In this battle he was Gandalf the White, not the Grey, remember? I don't mind any of it. In the end, it comes down to being mindful of each other's reasons to be in the hobby and remembering to tread carefully around those reasons. Back to random observation. So do scale modelers do non-metallic metal? I tried to do some on the way to oversized shell and the brass details on the greenskins. Again, to try and mash up as many visual aspects as possible, and, it's always good practice. I ended the orcs with a varnish, and once that was dry, a delicate wash with a very dark brown oil wash, to get a little more contrast. I won't show you too much of this because, well, seriously, how many oil washes are we going to have to look at in the one video? Enough. Half of the Warhammer people have already run off at the first oil paint installment, and now you want to make another? Think of the YouTube statistics, for Pete's sake. By the way, while on that subject, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I'm repeatedly doing all the wrong things on YouTube, and so it's not really paying the bills. And when one spends every day for 3 weeks making a very long video on painting a tank with goblins in it, well, the money needs to come from somewhere. And I was hoping you'd help me out. Thanks. Finally, the lovely base. I still can't get over how well this 3D print with a bit of grime and dirt on top worked out. The base is not going to make a huge impact visually, but it's a lovely situational thing. And I thought I'd try and make a realm in between the goblins and the tank. Something resting on realism, but with a sense of models on a tabletop type terrain. Of maybe a few too many color tints to be fully realistic, a bit too much drama, perhaps, but nothing that will poke any eyes out. I'm not sure where this is, why goblins are manhandling a tank, what city this would be. I do know that bricks are a great contrast to the greenish tank, and that all bricks in a wall are not always the same exact shade of brick, especially not back in the day, as this must be. My favourites have always been the burned ones, the almost black bricks. I sometimes wonder if someone got fired, no pun intended, burning the bricks. I also wonder why we had to go perfect the process so much. Can't we just burn a brick every now and again, spice up our monochrome urban lives? And I've been thinking about the setting itself. And here is another difference, one I'm very glad for. Fantasy and sci-fi dioramas very often picture a morbid scene. Piles of skull, decapitated elves, holes blasted through super soldiers, rivers of blood. A scale model scene thankfully does not do this, as we are in a historical context. Often they're surprisingly peaceful, depicting a tank refueling or stuck in the mud. A human side, honouring the soldiers who fought, perhaps. Scenes I'd love to see in fantasy dioramas too. Oh, and yeah, I figured if I just don't talk so much about the fact that I'm using oil paints again, then maybe no one notices. But I mean, honestly, oil paint for staining and weathering is just great. This video is just an example of the many thoughts I have on our lovely hobby. I also really wanted to paint a tank, and I just love to paint goblins. I really do wish we would hang out more, scale model folk and tabletop painting folk. Why we humans build camps fortified with walls and keep the gate is maybe understandable at times, but I personally don't get it. Sure, we like tribes, but I figure painting little plastic models puts us all in the same tribe. At any rate, I thoroughly enjoyed myself. My little scene is complete after countless hours, something that indeed brings us together. The urge to put paint on plastic and forget about time. The bridge over the cliff. I imagine this crew, Mr. Commander Orc daydreaming of a calmer existence without the feverish disturbance of the tank crew. The Goblin Captain has spotted what is probably nothing that should be shot at and is desperately trying to get the Orc's attention and permission to shoot. The spotter locking in the gun and the ammunitions goblin super excited about finding bigger shells. The bigger the shell, the bigger the bang. Thank you for watching. Thank you to Frozen for supporting creators like myself, and immense thanks to my patrons who keep this all afloat. Bye.